Okay, let's get started. Hi, I am Eleni Manis. I am the research director at S.T.O.P, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and welcome to our panel. This is Abortion and Gender-Affirming Care Under Surveillance. As you know, last June, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and 1 year later, 14 states have abortion bans, and half of states have tried or are trying to ban abortion. In the meanwhile, at least 7 states have banned gender-affirming care, and more bans are in preparation. Today, the Washington Post reported that there are 142 healthcare-related bills introduced to target the LGBTQ+ community in just 2023. States' bans on abortion and gender-affirming care have turned healthcare seekers into healthcare refugees. These are people who have to travel far from their homes, if they can at all, to get the care that they need. And we're here to talk about how smartphone spying and digital surveillance endanger these healthcare refugees and their families and healthcare providers. So to get started, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, Daley Barnett is a staff technologist at EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She founded T for Tech, a trans-forward tech collective. Daley is also part of Hacking Hustling, a sex workers advocacy organization. She is an artist, an activist, and a community organizer. Welcome. I'd also like to welcome Fikayo Walter Johnson, who's a research assistant at Pregnancy Justice, a reproductive justice group that focuses on those pregnant people who are most at risk of being criminalized. Previously, Fikayo was a paralegal with the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project at the ACLU. Also want to welcome Haley Tsukayama, who is a senior legislative activist at EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She focuses on state legislation there. And Haley covered big tech for the Washington Post for 8 years as a consumer technology reporter. We are also expecting Evan Greer, who I can introduce when she arrives. To the audience, we're really glad you're here. Hope folks in Costa Rica are enjoying it there. And we hope you're going to join us in this dialogue. You can use, it looks like you can use the chat function, or maybe there's a Q&A function. I can't see the same interface that you're seeing, but please put questions in the chat and we will get to them. So let's set the stage. What does this new wave of laws that criminalize abortion and that criminalize gender-affirming care look like? Who's at risk of prosecution? Tell me something about what's at stake. Fikayo, did you want to get started?
Yeah, of course. As Pregnancy Justice, we like to say abortion is about pregnancy. And in our work, we lead documentation on instances of pregnancy criminalization across the US. So this includes abortions, stillbirths, miscarriages, as well as substance use during pregnancy, which account for a very large portion of the cases that we see. But the fact of the matter is the landscape, what it looks like is that most abortion bans focus on providers who can face civil or criminal penalties. And historically, only 7 states have explicitly criminalized self-managed abortion. Today, that number is just 2. But what we've seen in practice is that laws meant to address child abuse, assault, the handling of human remains, homicide in very extreme cases are being misapplied to allegations of self-managed abortion. So we focus on pregnant people who are most at risk for criminalization and state control, and that includes those who are low income, of color, drug using, the people that exist at the intersection of all those identities. And it's a very dangerous landscape for people who are pregnant, because, you know, when we think about people being criminalized for their pregnancy outcomes, and the fact that there is a 10 to 20% chance of a miscarriage in every pregnancy, what it looks like is law enforcement looking for evidence that someone perhaps intended to miscarry or was otherwise endangering the viability of their pregnancy.
And to piggyback on that, thank you, Fakaya, that was a really excellent answer. From the gender affirming care piece, what we've seen, there are actually about 19 states that are targeting gender affirming care in some form that we've seen. Bans look different, right? In some states, they are looking at healthcare providers. So in the same way that Fakaya was talking about for pregnancy, some states make providing care a felony even. So these are pretty high penalties. Others ban people from, so they're also targeting people who are supporting people trying to seek this care, right? So they ban people from knowingly engaging in conduct that aids or abets providing care. Some are looking at funding, right? They're saying you can't use public funds to provide this care, or you can't use state property to provide this care. And some have also gone looking at preventing out-of-state providers from providing telehealth care to people in states. And so in terms of who's in danger, I mean, certainly the people who are seeking the care are in danger. The people who love them, who are trying to support them in providing that care, are in danger. The people who provide that care are in danger. And so it is a whole, it's the whole ecosystem, right? It's the whole support network that we're really seeing on both, I think, repro and gender affirming care.
And I can jump into on that like Haley just sort of hearkened to the community of people that could be affected by this. And I would just maybe emphasize that the community that could be affected is much broader than we might think initially. Like, of course, there are the people, the patients, the providers of care. There are the people who are most closely connected to the patients or the people seeking healthcare. And then there are the community organizers. There are the platform owners who are acting as sort of intermediaries, passing that data through them. When, like, hopefully it just paints the portrait that these issues affect many people immediately, and they should be a concern to everyone more broadly, right?
I'm going to take a moment to welcome and introduce Evan Greer, who is the director of the digital rights group Fight for the Future. She is a trans and queer activist and an expert on tech policy and human rights. Evan's also a musician whom I admire a lot. You can check out her latest album, Spotify Surveillance. Really cool to meet you. So
Sorry, I was late.
No, you got stuck in the waiting room for a little bit. So we were just talking about what the new wave of laws criminalizing abortion and gender affirming care look like, and who is being targeted by these laws, which sounds like everyone who touches reproductive or gender affirming care. We know, those of us who keep up with the news know quite a bit about abortion prosecutions, but think about how to ask this question. Historically, most abortion prosecutions that we've heard about start with a tip to police. My patient sought an abortion. This neighbor got an abortion, but digital surveillance changes that. And I'd like to know how it does.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what the landscape looks like is both a combination of analog and digital surveillance, which S.T.O.P highlights in their Pregnancy Panopticon white paper, as well as highlighted in Cynthia Conti-Cook's Surveilling the Digital Abortion Diary, and in what we found in our work is that family welfare authorities, medical professionals are certainly, that is kind of the site for the beginning of criminalization, unfortunately, in the healthcare setting. And from there, law enforcement use that tip to then get a warrant to seize and then search an individual's device and look for evidence that might support this theory that they were seeking a miscarriage or endangering their fetus. And unfortunately, there have been two really high-profile cases where this has occurred, Latice Fisher and Purvi Patel. But even in a more recent example that was brought to national attention. A mother and daughter who had allegedly purchased abortion pills online. Their law enforcement got a warrant to get access to their Facebook DMs and uncovered their conversation, relating to seeking an abortion. And what sticks out in that particular case is that they were originally charged with removing or concealing a dead human body, and a Meta representative said, hey, nothing in the warrants mentioned anything about abortion. And as I mentioned earlier, what's happening is that people are being criminalized for this behavior, but it's under statutes that we wouldn't necessarily blink an eye to. And so it presents a very, it's a concerning landscape when things like this happen. It's really rather unfortunate. And, speaking to Latisse and Purvi's cases, their web history, and specifically, I think Latisse Fisher's web history was used to support this theory that she didn't want to have, that she didn't want her, her fetus to survive. So when we think about that, it means that, someone who finds out they're pregnant, maybe they look up their options and say, I decided to take this pregnancy to term. Later on, they experience a miscarriage or stillbirth, and for whatever reason, hospital staff are suspicious of this pregnancy loss. They could be opening themselves up to criminal prosecution, and no one should have to deal with that after experiencing a pregnancy loss. They shouldn't have to deal with it because they decide to terminate their pregnancy either. But it's unfortunate that that's what the landscape has looked like pre-Dobbs, and it's unfortunately something that we're still seeing today.
I'm happy to wing in a little bit on this one as well, if it's helpful, just because I came in late. So maybe other folks have already said some of this stuff, but yeah, thanks again for having me and for this discussion. I think one thing I just wanted to add, and I think you really underscored this in what you just said, is we need to think of this as not just an individual problem, but as a collective threat. And I think that's really important because I feel like in the wake of Dobbs, and anyone who's heard me talk about this has heard me say this already, but there was every reporter in the world contacted me and wanted to know about menstrual tracking apps. And there was 3 news cycles of menstrual tracking app panic. And the sensitive health data that apps like that collect is totally a valid thing to be concerned about. But I think it's a great example of perhaps missing the forest for the trees, or just misreading what the threat model actually is in terms of people who historically have been criminalized around their reproductive choices, how that happens as was just described. But I'll also just note that for me, the thing that I'm spending the most time kind of lying awake worrying about is less prosecutions of individual people who are seeking reproductive health care, although that's definitely something to be concerned about. But it's the constellation of the criminalization of a wide range of activities related to facilitating people's reproductive health care. And so we are seeing, for example, the main law that the National Right to Life Committee, the model law that they're pushing across the country, would criminalize not just providing an abortion or seeking an abortion, but, for example, being a payment processor that processes donations to an abortion provider. Or even in some cases, some of these laws I read as criminalizing being a CDN, like Cloudflare, that provides DDoS protection for an organization like Planned Parenthood. And so I think zooming out a little bit, for me, it just helps to think through the threat model of a local abortion fund that's communicating on Slack and sending money via Venmo to people who are then going to use that money to travel out of state in receive an abortion that would be illegal in that state. And so the things that I tend to worry about and think about are, if Slack gets a subpoena for that organization's communications, even if it does say it's about abortion, I think one thing to just note about every corporation in the US is they will tell you the same thing, which is we comply with the laws and regulations in the jurisdictions where we operate. And as much as we disagree with those laws and think that many of them are blatantly unconstitutional and problematic, while they are in effect, a company like Slack will absolutely comply with a subpoena from the Attorney General of Texas or the Attorney General of Mississippi. And so that's why Fight for the Future has been pushing so hard for companies like Slack to implement end-to-end encryption as an option for all users. That would go a long way toward protecting the communications of people that are engaged in organizing and facilitation around providing people with this essential life-saving healthcare. And so I just think that's something that we think about a lot, and I think just needs to be focused in on more in terms of thinking through the healthcare system, particularly, which is an area of, it's a sector where there's a lot of record keeping, right? That perhaps differentiates it from other worlds. But there's still a lot that we can do to protect the security of communications of people who are organizing. And that's where we've been sort of focused and thinking through is what's the threat model for organizations and networks, more so than for individuals, although that's totally valid too. It's just something that perhaps is solved more through things like Digital Defense League and folks like that doing awesome training and support. But for us in the advocacy land, we're trying to look at this as a collective problem that we solve with collective action.
Let me take you in a slightly different but related direction. So Fikayo gave us court cases where individuals were targeted and their digital data was used as corroborating evidence to show that they'd done something. Evan's talking about the broadening of targets in abortion and gender-affirming care prosecutions. Do you worry about profiling of individuals, the identification of previously unknown abortion seekers or people seeking gender-affirming care using their digital data, their internet search histories, their texts, maybe their geolocation data, placing them at sensitive locations? What should we be worried about the profiling of people seeking reproductive or gender-affirming care using their digital data? Or is this just a radical?
Yeah. I mean, as Evan said, like an abortion fund kind of presents a particular threat model of someone who might be at very high risk in this sort of community, because they're not just processing information for one person, but of many people connected to what is now considered criminal activity, right? So I particularly worry about people who are kind of in that position of not just handling their own digital footprints, but the digital footprints of many other people within a network, right? So the community organizers, the abortion funds, the people who are, doing like online activism, etc.
I got myself muted for a second. Tell me more about that.
Well, so abortion funds that maybe have been operating in more traditionally, like abortion funds in places who like only until recently are criminalizing abortion, right? They maybe don't have the operational security like instinct yet to be committing crimes and to be doing it like on behalf of people that need healthcare. So they suddenly have to go through these databases that they've been operating in the clear and have to like find out new ways to have like cold redundant backups that are encrypted and safe from police or safe from subpoena, or their communications methods, like Evan was saying, if they're operating on Slack or they're doing all of their organizing on like Google Suite. I mean, we can't trust these companies. We have never really trusted these companies to keep our data private, but it's only now that this activity is criminalized, when that lens of criminality shifts, that we're suddenly like, oh, that really does matter. The lack of privacy is a huge concern, and it affects people's very real safety.
Got it. So when we're wondering about how folks will be profiled, you're pointing to groups that consolidate the data, who may not well protect the data, who may be keeping it too long. Got it. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about surveillance tactics that have emerged to aid prosecutions related to gender-affirming care. What tactics are being used or could be used in these kinds of prosecutions? What kinds of tactics are already being used to harass young people and their families who are seeking gender-affirming care? And one big question, are these the same kinds of surveillance techniques that are being used to prosecute and harass abortion seekers?
So I'm happy to jump on this briefly. And what I'd say is that as we're seeing with anti-abortion laws post-Roe, there's going to be a bit of a lag time before we actually kind of find out about these cases, right? So for example, in the Nebraska case that we were just talking about, that actually happened a little while ago, right? And we only found out about it because of court proceedings and discovery, et cetera. And then there's news reporting on it. So I'm actually not personally aware right now of specific cases related to the provision of gender-affirming care that are being prosecuted using digital surveillance data. That doesn't mean that they're not out there. And in fact, I would be willing to bet money that there are some such cases that are, beginning to proceed. It's also important to note that this new wave of anti-trans legislation is relatively new. And so and a lot of it is actually, fortunately, thanks to folks like Chase Strangio and others getting tied up in court or in some cases overturned. And so, this is definitely it's a real concern, but it's a little bit more forward looking in terms of what could happen. So setting all that aside in terms of, how can this go down? In a lot of ways, it's not particularly different than the way that the surveillance state enforces other laws, right? And so, we've perhaps focused quite a bit on things like cell phone location data, which is a real concern. But in the end, the first course that the cops always use is like, they want what's on your phone, and they want what's in your email, and they want what's in your Google Drive folder, and they want your text messages. And so I do think it is important that we just keep in mind that long before the FBI is monitoring your real-time location, they're subpoenaing you and your ex-boyfriend, and you're in trouble already, right? And so I do think it's important just to think through the different threat models. But all of that said, two more pieces I did want to just throw out there is automated license plate readers and facial recognition. And again, this is more in the theoretical as far as I know. I do not know of any law enforcement agency or non-state actor that's actively using this technology right now. But I cannot imagine that they will not. And I do want to just point out that what I just said there around non-state actors. So we know, for example, that extremist anti-abortion groups, forced birth organizations have used surveillance to target and harass people who seek abortions, people who provide abortions, people who facilitate abortions. We know that they've used kind of the old school model of just writing down people's license plates, monitoring who goes to abortion clinics. There is now technology that is widely available that will basically do that for them. And I would imagine it's only a matter of time before extreme right groups are doing that kind of thing and using, for example, perhaps Amazon's commercially available facial recognition technology to out people who go into a Planned Parenthood clinic or go into a clinic that's providing gender-affirming care. That's a really difficult problem to tackle from a regulatory perspective and just from a kind of digital defense perspective. But those are the types of things that I think we need to be getting ahead of now. And that frankly, organizations that provide this type of care need to be thinking about in terms of their overall security plan to kind of, how do we protect the physical safety and the physical privacy of people who are seeking and providing this type of care in an environment where it is increasingly being criminalized and where the kind of ground is consistently shifting beneath folks' feet. So a little bit of a ramble there, but hopefully that gives folks a bit of a picture of the hellscape that we are unfortunately approaching unless we can get some policies in place as well as arm ourselves with both knowledge and tools to protect the safety, security, privacy, and rights of people seeking both abortion and gender-affirming care.
Yeah, I want to get to the other members of the panel, but before we do, I want to push you a little bit to unpack something for the audience. So you mentioned the possibility of ALPRs being used, automated license plate readers. How could license plate records or parking garage records be a threat to people who are visiting healthcare clinics?
Yeah, for sure. So again, let's envision the scenario where law enforcement are investigating a family who they believe has brought their child to receive gender-affirming care that they have now decided to criminalize, despite all evidence. They're going to be looking for evidence to prove that this procedure or visit or whatever happened, right? And so they may get text messages that could show them that. They could use cell phone location data to show, well, these people went to this clinic on this time. But one of the easiest ways to do it for most folks who tend to use cars, particularly in more rural areas, would be to use automated license plate readers that basically interact with the database, a state-run database of license plates that they can identify whose car is where at any given time. You mentioned parking garage records. I think a lot about things even like CCTV footage from the store across the street. I think about Ring camera footage. I worry all the time about abortion clinics and others that have their own CCTV footage that could be subpoenaed. I'm not sure what's happening there in terms of retention, et cetera, but that's something that organizations should definitely be thinking about. But I think just broadly speaking, in terms of ALPRs, it's an automated way to track where people go. And that can be used as evidence to prosecute people if you're prosecuting them based on going to a place to receive a particular type of care that you're trying to criminalize.
Okay, last follow-up question. So prosecutor in Idaho, which recently criminalized the in-state leg of certain travel for abortion care, wants license plate data from California or another state where the care was provided legally. Can they get their hands on out-of-state ALPR data?
Maybe someone from EFF wants to answer this because I know that they are working on that specific question, but I can too. But go for it, Haley.
Yeah, so California and several other states have tried to pass what people are often calling like shield laws or abortion shield laws or something like that, right? To interfere with that process. So in California, for example, if you get a subpoena or a warrant from an out-of-state law enforcement agency, you have to issue a identical subpoena in California to get that from a California law enforcement agency or from a company. And last year, California passed a law, I should say, that blocks, so for abortion care, both companies and healthcare providers from having to respond to those, keeps California from issuing that subpoena. This year, we're working on particularly a bill that would ban what we call reverse demands. So when you're looking for like everyone who is at a specific point or everyone who looked for a specific keyword to cover both reproductive and gender affirming care, we're trying to pass that bill. So it's evolving. It really depends on where you are in which state you're in, but there are definitely states that are trying to step up and say, no, we have a right to abortion here and we want to protect that for people who come here.
Just to pull back, what I'm hearing is that law enforcement would love to get your phone, but if they can't, they can get your license plate data and they can track you using your travel data. There are a variety of different sources of digital data that can be used to place a person or their family at a reproductive clinic or a gender-affirming healthcare clinic. And it's not enough to turn your phone off and leave it home. There is a question in the chat, and it's probably about time for it, which is, let's talk about strategies that people can use, safety measures that people can take if they want to stay safe from policing or digital surveillance or keep their families safe from that kind of surveillance. And I'll add just as a side note, if you have any special advice for trans or queer students who are increasingly surveilled at school, I want to know that too.
I'm happy to jump in here first, and I'm glad you mentioned at school, because I actually meant to mention this earlier when you were asking about kind of the types of surveillance tools that will likely be used to enforce these types of anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ laws that we know are passing across the country. And school surveillance software is a big one that I worry a lot about. Some folks watching may be familiar with a company called Gaggle. which bills itself as student safety software, basically uses AI to scan students' emails and other communications within a school district that has implemented this, looking for certain keywords. They bill themselves as being about harm prevention. So they're looking for things like suicidality or substance abuse. But we actually know that many school districts have used this to even just scan kids' emails because they're swearing. And various things like that. And we also know that previously, this software was used to out LGBTQ students to administrators and in some cases to parents. They've since allegedly removed some of the keywords that were doing that from their database. But in the end, this is effectively school surveillance software that absolutely can and will be used against LGBTQ students. And that's one of the things I worry about and think a lot about, especially since it's being sold and billed as safety software, that it's supposed to be protecting vulnerable kids, when in fact, in the environment that we're in, it's almost certain to put them in more danger. In terms of this question about what folks can do to protect themselves, I'm always like a little bit hesitant to answer this in the context of like a panel like this, because, you know, really the answer is you should seek out someone that can help you. Ava at EFF is awesome. Digital Defense Fund is awesome. If you or your organization are particularly at risk, you should not listen to someone like me ramble off, like change the password on your phone, get a VPN, use Signal. You should seek out some support from someone that can help you get set up. That said, I am happy to ramble off a few of those things before the end if we want, but maybe I'll pass it to other panelists and see what they want to say on this. And you know, my strong suggestion would really be to seek out either one of the extensive guides that folks like EFF have put out, or a specific person to help support, just because, you know, it's important to get it right. And it's important to like talk people through. Everyone has a different threat model. Everyone has different levels of risk. And I don't like scaring people or making people feel ashamed about digital security. I think it's so important that we recognize that like we all kind of struggle with this a little bit. And again, it's a collective problem and not an individual one. This isn't something we can solve by switching apps or switching the settings on our phone. We have to fight to protect the most vulnerable folks that are likely not going to do that because they're not sitting and watching this panel, right? So again, happy to give a few quick tips before the end, but let's see what other folks have to say on that.
Yeah, I can jump in. I really appreciate folks elevating the fact that it's not just about the people who are seeking reproductive health care in the work that we do. It's also the folks that help them. It's absolutely a community effort, and it's really important to have that framing. I also think, speaking like, sorry, like on the individual level though, and it's funny, like this kind of applies, like obviously we're talking about it in the reproductive and healthcare like space, but like it really applies to like every individual. And but to say like first, like do not give your phone to the police, you know, just basic, you know, have very strong passwords. And then also, you know, there are several, EFF included, several organizations that are trying to bring Fourth Amendment protections into the digital age. So, you know, challenging the scope of digital searches by law enforcement, making sure they aren't engaging in indiscriminate searches of our devices. You know, the example is you wouldn't look for a gun inside a pill bottle. Like there's no reason they should be, you know, holding on to the data they extract from our phones and searching through it willy-nilly. I think it's as many have said, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's litigation, it's grassroots organizing and advocacy, it's putting pressure on corporations. But I know speaking a little bit on the individual side, like those are some things you can definitely consider. Yeah.
I would like to jump in too. Okay, so where do I start? Like well, as Fikayo just outlined, like there's a sort of big picture analysis of like it's affecting everyone, right? And there are like particular points of view that we can kind of go after to protect each other. I guess starting at like the small level, when you mentioned like what can trans students do, or really any LGBT student that is like worried about their being outed or whatever by the places they live. As Evan mentioned, the school monitoring software is pretty dangerous, and it has a reputation of outing students. Gaggle, definitely, Bark, GoGuardian, the like, Lightbeam, I think. As far as I know, until I get my hands on a device that like has that software installed in it, you can't get around that information. You can't get around those like monitoring software using proxies like VPNs. Back like in the old days when we would do that. So for students or people who know students that are worried about this, just advise them to compartmentalize sensitive activities onto different devices entirely. That's like the quickest and easiest way to get around that. And I think that compartmentalization like is a key tactic that I emphasize in all of the digital security trainings that I give, because it is like the easiest thing to think about when it comes to just like containing sensitive activities away from other ones. And there are technical ways to do this, but I always like to push for the social protections first before the technical ones. So now zooming out to like big picture, you know, the law fails us. It fails to protect us. It fails to protect people that are just seeking control over their own bodies and like a dignified life, right? So there are all sorts of communities that have been organizing under that principle for a long time. So, you know, folks that are really good at this tactic of compartmentalization are going to be, you know, sex workers, trans liberation, harm redux activists, disability rights, abortion access. All of these communities need to, well, there is a lot of cross, you know, contamination of resources and knowledge that's happening between these communities. But I think for those that aren't already doing that, to seek outwards for those communities that have those shared struggles, right? Because especially the ones that have been operating under criminalized contexts for so long, sex workers, we know like how to get around this stuff and how to continue having dignity and caring for each other despite the law. So recognizing those shared struggles, we can maybe, you know, recognize shared liberation. And you know, digital safety stuff, community digital safety agreements, like what can we talk about in shared circles, what can we not talk about, what data or information is only shared with particular people in the group. So team roles, collective operational security trainings about that kind of stuff, like know your rights, what to do if the cops come, et cetera. Secure communication strategies, end-to-end encrypted, of course. Signal is like the go-to for a reason, but there are other ways to do it as well. Strong data backup games for like community activists or people who are in that, you know, particular threat model that I talked about earlier, who are handling many people's data, like within a network, need to reevaluate their data backup game, and they need to have cold, redundant, encrypted backups in multiple locations, hopefully protected by people that have been designated team roles within those groups, right? Primary alternate contingency plans. There's a ton that I could go over, and as Evan said, you know, seek out the experts who are talking about this if you're really worried about it. But those are just a list of things you can do now.
Seek out daily. Thanks. What is the path forward? How do we fix this? What are your biggest legislative asks? What are your biggest asks of tech companies?
Oh, so many asks. But I can outline a couple that we're thinking about. So I think first and foremost, you know, because the way that these prosecutions can be pursued, right, it's like so multifaceted, would love to see some general consumer privacy legislation, would love to see, you know, just general laws that protect all kinds of data that can be used in these investigations. So that's a big ask, but that is like a very like genuine, deeply held one for me. In terms of like kind of more specific legislation, so I mentioned already that we're in California, we're looking at the reverse demand legislation, which others are also looking at. location data privacy bills, health privacy bills, particularly also looking at like electronic health records and health information exchanges, looking at how that information passes across state lines. So Maryland passed a bill, you know, saying that they have extra protections for, you know, abortion or gender affirming care procedures that go into those systems. California is running a bill right now that we're supporting, really looking at bringing in as many of these really vectors for, you know, possible information sharing and bringing them under privacy laws as possible, right? Just like trying to extend that umbrella as far as we possibly can, to just really kind of address this issue. You know, we are also seeing, it's really a state by state thing, right? We're seeing some states we're seeing a split, right? We're seeing some states really go into the criminalization and the prosecution, and then we're seeing other states, California, Washington, Massachusetts, New York, to name a couple, right? Really trying to build these walls, making kind of data sanctuary states around this kind of care. So I think supporting those as far, you know, as far and as hard as you possibly can is really important. And I'll stop there, but that's kind of my like from the heart rant about what bills we could be seeing.
Let me ask you a question, Haley, before I pose the question to everybody else, which is what happens when state law meets state law? One state's courts are supposed to respect the judgments and laws of another state. What happens when a state like Idaho and other states that are attempting to do the same criminalize not the abortion that occurs across state lines, but that portion of the trip that's in Idaho? Are these laws, they look like laws that are trying to reach beyond a state's own jurisdiction to ban care or their receipt of care, that it's perfectly legal where it's administered. What's your take?
So great question.
Are the laws constitutional? Will they stand under the full faith and credit clause?
So great question. This is one I should bring up. I really should make an actual sign, but my like theoretical sign of like, I'm not a lawyer, right? So I really shouldn't be weighing in necessarily, but certainly in the analysis that we've done about the bills that we're running, right, is that, you know, we feel that states have had different laws about things like gay marriage, for example, marriage equality, I should say, right? Like there are things that have had different approaches. And so, you know, there is some room for that to exist. I think I certainly expect that some of these laws will have lawsuits, and so we may find out in the courts. And so it's in some ways that is an unresolved question for me on the legislative side. Like that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying, right? I really want to see these protections. I really feel like these are communities that are imminently under threat, imminently under attack. And so I want to try and advance what I can, and we'll just kind of have to see how it shakes out in some cases. But I feel good about the analysis that I've seen that, you know, the bills that we're running that there is an argument and a path to keeping them in place.
I guess I was pushing you to ask whether the laws criminalizing abortion and gender affirming care outside of a state's own boundaries could possibly stand.
Yeah, yeah, we're put on my not a lawyer hat again. I think we'll have to see what courts say about that as well.
Yeah. Other folks on their legislative asks, what do we most need?
I'm happy to jump in on this. I mean, I think there's a few different ways to look at this. I mean, you know, one thing is we need a nationally codified Roe right to an abortion law. That would be great. And something similar for gender affirming care. That feels fairly far off at this point. So in terms of looking specifically at the kind of digital surveillance landscape here, I basically agree with everything that Haley just said. A federal data privacy law, hello, national embarrassment that we do not have this, and would be arguably one of the most important things that could just sort of reduce the digital footprint of everyone all at the same time. So in terms of like, if I had one lever I could pull, that would be the lever. And I think that actually dovetails into, you also asked kind of what are our demands for companies? And I think that that is really important because I'll be frank, I don't have a whole lot of optimism for what our elected officials, for them rising to this moment. I don't have a lot of optimism about corporations rising to this moment either, but I have a tremendous amount of faith in all of us and our movement and our ability to hold powerful institutions accountable and extract concessions and change. And we've already seen some of that to a certain extent. But I think broadly speaking, our demand for companies is collect less data, period. Collect and store less data, I should say, specifically. Those are really the two things, right? Minimizing how much they collect in the first place, both legislatively and by beating up on them until they do, and minimizing how much data they retain for a longer period of time. That is what creates the surface area for surveillance. This is government surveillance that is built on top of corporate surveillance. And so reducing that corporate surveillance is one way to interrupt that government surveillance, even without a legislative fix. And so that means, things like calling on Google to stop collecting and retaining so much cell phone location data, which is something that a broad coalition of organizations have been pushing for. And that also speaks to our Make DMs Safe campaign, which I mentioned earlier, where we're pushing on companies like Slack and Discord and Twitter to actually implement strong end-to-end encryption by default for all users, as well as Meta. Meta has said that they're going to do this, but we haven't seen it yet. If they turned on end-to-end encryption on Messenger tomorrow, that would go so far in protecting the communications of hundreds of millions of people. So those are the types of things that we're demanding. I do want to just back up and say one thing about legislation, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but in terms of what we need, I also want to say something about what we don't need, because there are several bills that have been proposed that would actually make the situation worse. I'm thinking of things like the Earn It Act, which would potentially criminalize the proliferation of end-to-end encryption, literally basically making it much more difficult for the companies to do the types of things that I just said they should be doing in order to protect people's communications. I'm also thinking about legislation like KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, which is less in terms of data collection and surveillance, but creates a broad duty of care that would effectively force companies to filter content that a state attorneys general could argue leads to negative mental health outcomes for young people. In a world where this law is in place, we will absolutely see platforms like Instagram and YouTube, et cetera, engage in broad suppression of content related to LGBTQ issues, gender-affirming care, access to abortion. We're effectively empowering the same state attorneys general that are actively criminalizing gender-affirming care and abortion to dictate what speech can be recommended to young people on these platforms. That's a disaster for free expression, it's a disaster for human rights, and it's a disaster for marginalized people in the United States. And so I think it's really important that we say very clearly that we need to hold these big tech companies accountable. We need to abolish the surveillance capitalist business model that they've built their empire on top of, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't empower the very same bigots that are coming after our community. And so that means rejecting dangerous and misguided proposals like the Earn It Act, like KOSA, like Cooper Davis, like the newly introduced Stop CSAM Act. And I think it's really important that we say that and that we hold accountable folks within our own community that are unfortunately continuing to push those misguided proposals over the loud objections of reproductive rights groups, LGBTQ organizations, et cetera, on the ground. So said what I said. Feel free to DM me, at me if you're mad.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on this question?
Amen.
If not, I have a question from an audience member, which I'll summarize. And anybody else who has a question for our panelists, have at it, put it in the chat. So just to summarize, this is somebody who worries about their actions, their online activity, and how it poses a risk, and gets bogged down in going through the different steps provided by resources by groups like our own. Wants to be digitally secure, but you can see by the volume of text here, but it's just so hard. Where does the overwhelmed ordinary person who wants to be digitally secure, who wants to be supportive, even start, given how overwhelming it is to do that?
I would chime in here to say, don't beat up on yourself too much, because like, you know, the act of like beefing up your like operational security, or the resources that are available are like retooled from like corporate guides, right? For like how to protect corporate networks rather than social ones. So there's like a lot of there's a lot of work being done from the activist standpoint to try and like rehumanize these concepts. And it's an uphill battle for sure. That said, you know, the gold standard for where to begin is threat modeling. For a reason. It's a way of sort of like taking accountability, or like really like accounting for the digital footprint that you produce, or the sort of like the data civilian that you are in the world. And there are a multitude of ways to go about doing that. EFF has a pretty decent way of doing this, I think, where there's like 5 questions that we ask about like, you know, what are the assets that you want to protect and who you want to protect them from, and on and on. I think that the hard part then is accessing, or like finding the right modes of tactics, techniques, and procedures you want to incorporate based on the threat model. And unfortunately, there is kind of like a dearth of material from point A to B. On the surveillance self-defense website from EFF, it's ssd.eff.org. I helped to make a playlist for reproductive healthcare advocate, seeker, or I forget the whole title. We did this early last year, where I sort of curated a list of different guides that I foresaw as pertinent to the different threat model personas that were in the abortion access space right then. I think it could probably be revisited and more broadened out, but that might be a good place to start. And that would be under the security scenarios. I'll link to it in the chat. Also, you could check out the resources on T for Tech, where we've made like similar sort of like curated lists of recommendations of tactics, techniques, and procedures for different personas, aka different threat models that we can identify within the trans access space or the trans advocacy space. Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Or look at the zines that DDF has put out, or like the visual guides they put out, I think are super accessible. And again, doing that kind of like bridging work between the act of threat modeling and the recommendations that follow.
Thanks. I'll add that when I started making my devices more secure, I found other people who were already using the tools that I wanted to use, what I thought I should use. And I said, here's my phone. I'm a Luddite, help me. So just want to reiterate the find a friend advice. There's an interesting question in the sidebar that asks, can you talk more about COSA and how it's misguided? So this is for folks who don't know, this is the Kids Online Safety Act of 2022. What's wrong with COSA and how should we protect kids?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in on this one. And I don't mean to take up too much time on this. It's obviously extremely related to the issue that we're talking about, but I don't want to derail. But broadly speaking, I would say that COSA is part of a broader set of bills that are very well-intentioned, that seek to address very real problems, but unfortunately do so in a really problematic way that is actually likely to make all of those problems worse and not better. And I want to say that clearly because I think we often are, these issues are often characterized as if it's sort of like an ethereal debate between this like theoretical value of free expression and human rights and this like very concrete value of we want to keep children safe. And I want to be very clear that the consensus and the experts and the human rights groups that oppose these legislation We oppose COSA because we believe it will make kids less safe, not more safe. So this is not about trade-offs from my perspective. We actually think this legislation makes the situation worse. So I can quickly explain the kind of main concerns. At a high level, what COSA does is it creates a duty of care, so a legal requirement. And I should put on my I'm not a lawyer hat too, but I spend too much time with lawyers, so I can probably give this rundown. For companies to effectively design their products in a way that has the best interest of children in mind. Sounds great on paper. Unfortunately, there's no meaningful consensus about what that means. So the bill sponsors tried to narrow that duty of care by making it clear that they're saying you can't design your platform in a way that leads to these types of specific mental health outcomes like anxiety or depression, or the exacerbation of eating disorders or substance abuse. The duty of care does not just apply to things like design choices, which Fight for the Future actually would support strict regulation around things like autoplay or infinite scroll or other business practices that we know are predatory by nature, but it also sweeps in content recommendation. And that's where this bill and other bills like it, first of all, violate the First Amendment and are unquestionably going to fall apart under a First Amendment challenge. So if you're someone that cares about bringing lawsuits against tech companies to hold them accountable for the promotion of harmful content, this bill won't actually help you do that because it's unconstitutional and won't succeed. The ACLU has said that very clearly, as has EFF and others. But it's also where this bill would do more harm than good. We're essentially talking about something that is very much like S.T.O.P, but it applies to a much broader range of content. We know that S.T.O.P, which subjected platforms to liability for content related to sex trafficking, actually led to widespread over-removal of content that had nothing to do with sex trafficking, in some cases even just artwork or videos about sexual health. So we could expect with COSA to see something similar, widespread over-removal of content that's perhaps important but controversial. So I think a lot, and there's been a lot written about LGBTQ content specifically. The bill gives enforcement authority to state attorneys general, the same state attorneys general that we've been talking about throughout this entire call. And it allows them to bring suits against the platforms, arguing that they've violated this duty of care. We know, for example, that the Missouri Attorney General, when they implemented their executive order banning gender-affirming care, are we running out of time? I'm seeing you jump.
We're about to get cut off.
Okay.
Folks, we're going to be back next year.
COSA,
with
bad
a
bill.
panel.
Don't talk to me about
We'll
it.
be back
Happy to
next year
explain.
with a related panel. But I want to say thanks to Evan Greer from Fight for the Future. Thanks to Daly Barnett from EFF. Thanks to Haley Tsukiyama, also from EFF. Thank you to Fiyako Walter Johnson from Pregnancy Justice. This is Eleni Manis from the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And we'll see you next year.
Sorry about that.
Don't be sorry.
Don't ask me about COSA if you
We're
want me to only talk for 30 seconds.
we're not live anymore. I couldn't resist and what should we do to protect kids? Because LGBTQ plus kids are kids too. But
Yep.
It's such a pleasure to meet you both. Thanks for this.
Likewise.
How do I find cases that are being tried under these new laws banning gender-affirming care? Is it really just a wait? I want to know.